The day they read my uncle's will was the day I learned the sound of my own humiliation. It wasn't a loud sound. It was the rustle of paper in the county clerk's dry hands, followed by a pocket of silence, and then a single, sharp snort of laughter from the back of the room. That snort was like a lit match dropped on dry tinder. It caught, and a low, rolling chuckle spread through the gathered townsfolk of Redemption Valley. I was 18 years old, an orphan for the better part of a decade, and I stood there in my only clean shirt, feeling the heat rise in my neck. The clerk, a man with a face like worn leather, cleared his throat and continued, his voice devoid of any emotion. To my nephew, Samuel Ayers, I leave my sole earthly possession, my 30-acre parcel of land north of the valley, and all that is upon it. He folded the paper with a crisp finality. Mr. Davies, whose cattle grazed on 1,000 green acres that bordered the patch of land in question, was the one who had snorted. Now he spoke, his voice booming with false sympathy. 30 acres of rock and lizards, son. What a handsome inheritance. The laughter became open and unrestrained. He'll be the richest man in the boneyard, someone else called out. I felt my dog, Rook, press his heavy body against my leg, a low rumble starting in his chest. I put a hand on his neck to quiet him. My uncle had been a strange, solitary man, and his final act, it seemed, was a joke at my expense. The land was a local punchline, a raised spine of granite and shattered shale where nothing grew, nothing lived, and nothing of value had ever been found. It was a place the earth had forgotten to finish. I didn't say a word. I just stood there, letting their scorn wash over me, hardening something inside me that was already half-forged by loss. I looked from Davies's smug, sun-cracked face to the others, their expressions ranging from pity to outright glee. I made myself a promise in that silent, suffocating room. It wasn't a promise of revenge. It was simpler, colder. It was a promise of proof. I would not run. I would not sell the land for the handful of dollars someone might offer in pity. I would go there, and I would live on it. And one day, I swore to myself, in some way I couldn't yet imagine, they would stop laughing. They would come to my 30 acres of rock, and they would not be laughing at all. And if you've ever been handed something everyone else calls worthless, if you've ever been made to feel small in a room full of loud voices, then you know the kind of fuel a moment like that can give you. It's a cold fire, but it burns longer than any other. The next morning, Rook and I walked out of town. I had a sack on my back containing a skillet, a bag of flour, a tin of coffee, and my father's old hatchet. That was the entirety of my worldly wealth, besides the deed to the land now tucked inside my shirt. The walk took 3 hours. The farther we got from the green, watered valley, the more the landscape changed. The rich soil thinned, giving way to sand and then to gravel. The air grew hotter, bouncing off the pale stone that began to jut from the ground like broken bones. My uncle's property began at a line of rusted barbed wire, a pathetic attempt to claim something no one else wanted. On it was a small, dilapidated shack, its wood bleached grey by 100 seasons of sun and wind. This was to be my home. The first few weeks were a lesson in brutal practicality. The shack's roof was more hole than shingle, and the first rain taught me that lesson with a series of miserable, muddy drips. I spent 2 days patching it with flattened coffee tins and tar I scavenged from a discarded barrel miles away. There was no well, only a half-collapsed rain cistern that held a few inches of brackish, mosquito-larva-filled water. For fresh water, I had to hike 2 miles to the nearest creek with a pair of buckets, a back-breaking chore that ate up half of every morning. Rook, my steadfast German shepherd, seemed untroubled. He found shade where there was none, chased rabbits I could never hope to catch, and at night, he slept with his body curled against mine, a warm, living anchor in the profound and sometimes terrifying silence. The land itself was a hostile presence. It was not a gentle, rolling landscape. It was sharp. Jagged shelves of shale littered the ground, making every step a potential turned ankle. Great, smooth domes of granite rose up, too steep to climb, reflecting the sun's glare with blinding intensity. There was no topsoil to speak of. Dust and grit got into everything, my food, my water, my bedroll. I learned to live with a constant, thin layer of it on my skin. I hunted, but the game was scarce and lean. A few rabbits, the occasional quail. Most nights, dinner was a thin stew or a piece of hard, fried bread. Hunger became a dull, constant companion. Loneliness was another. There were days I wouldn't hear a human voice, and the sound of my own when I spoke to Rook was jarring. The town's laughter echoed in that silence, a ghost I couldn't shake. I held out for a month before my supplies ran dry. The trip back into Redemption Valley was something I dreaded more than a dry canteen. Walking down the main street, I could feel the eyes on me. The whispers were just as loud as the laughter had been. "There's the rock farmer," I heard a woman say to her friend as they ducked into the mercantile. I kept my eyes forward, my jaw set. I sold the 2 rabbit pelts I'd managed to cure for a pittance, enough for another bag of flour and some salt. As I was counting the coins, Mr. Davies entered the store, his presence filling the small space. He looked me up and down, a smirk playing on his lips. "Still king of your mountain, boy?" he asked, his voice loud enough for everyone to hear. I didn't answer, just gathered my things. But as I turned to leave, a quiet voice cut through the tense air. "Leave the boy be, Henry." It was Ben, the town's blacksmith. He was an older man, built like one of his own anvils, with hands permanently stained black from coal and iron. He rarely spoke, and when he did, people tended to listen. He wasn't looking at Davies, he was looking at a horseshoe in his hand, inspecting its curve. Davies grunted, his amusement soured. "Just having a bit of fun." Ben finally looked up, his eyes a pale, clear blue in his soot-dusted face. He met my gaze for a moment, and in it, I saw not pity, but a flicker of something else. A quiet appraisal. "Fun's easy to have when you're standing on soft ground," Ben said, his voice flat. He turned his attention back to the horseshoe. The moment was broken. Davies bought his tobacco and left, and the store returned to its quiet business. I finished my transaction and stepped back out into the blistering sun. As I passed the smithy on my way out of town, Ben was at his forge, the rhythmic clang of his hammer echoing off the buildings. He stopped as I drew near, wiping his brow with the back of a leather-gloved hand. He nodded toward my parcel of land, a dark silhouette against the bright sky. "My grandfather was a prospector," he said, his voice low and raspy. "He used to say, folks only ever look for the color. They never look at the bones." He picked up his hammer again. "Rock has a memory, boy. You just have to learn how to read it." He didn't offer any more, and I didn't ask. He just went back to his work, shaping the glowing metal with deliberate, powerful blows. That one cryptic comment was more encouragement than I had received in my entire life. It was a tool, just as real as the hatchet in my sack. Rock has a memory. The phrase turned over and over in my mind the entire walk home, the rhythm of my steps matching the phantom clang of Ben's hammer. Ben's words changed the way I saw the land. Before, it was an adversary, a 30-acre expanse of punishment. Now, it was a book written in a language I didn't understand. So I set out to learn it. I stopped thinking about survival one day at a time and started thinking in seasons, in patterns. I decided to walk every square foot of my inheritance. I started in the southeast corner and began a systematic grid search, my pace slow and deliberate. Rook trotted alongside me, his nose to the ground, reading his own version of the land story. The work was grueling. The summer sun was relentless, and by mid-morning, the rocks were too hot to touch. I learned to work in the cooler hours of the dawn and the long shadows of the evening. I wore through the soles of my only pair of boots in the first 2 weeks. I patched them with rabbit hide, a clumsy but functional repair. My hands, already calloused, grew tougher, the skin thickening into a protective layer against the sharp edges of shale. I wasn't looking for anything in particular, not gold, not silver, not a single thing the world called valuable. I was just looking. I was observing. I started to notice things I'd previously ignored. The way a certain type of grey, flaky rock always appeared in long, straight lines, like seams stitched into the earth. The way rainwater, on the rare occasions it fell, didn't pool but vanished instantly into a network of tiny, invisible cracks. I started a map, sketching on the back of old feed sacks with a piece of charcoal from my fire. I drew the major granite outcrops, the deep fissures that split the land, the subtle changes in elevation that were invisible from a distance. Rook was my guide in many ways. His senses were so much sharper than mine. He would stop and paw at a certain spot, sniffing intently at a crack in the ground I hadn't even seen. He'd lead me to patches of hardy, deep-rooted bushes I'd overlooked, their survival a small miracle in this barren place. Days bled into weeks. July burned into August. The initial derision from the town had faded into simple forgetting. I was out of sight, out of mind, just a strange boy and his dog living on a pile of rocks. But for me, the rocks were no longer a pile. They were a complex, interlocking system. The memory Ben had spoken of wasn't a story of the past, but a map of the present. It was a map of structure, of weakness and strength, of how the earth had been buckled and folded and stressed into its current shape. The work gave me a sense of purpose that hunger and loneliness couldn't erase. I was no longer just enduring, I was investigating. And with each passing day, the land felt less like a curse and more like a puzzle. A vast, silent, sun-baked puzzle that held a single, secret piece I was determined to find. The drought began not as an event, but as an absence. It was the absence of the usual late summer thunderstorms, the absence of dew on the ground in the morning. The sky remained a vast, empty, bleached blue canvas, day after day. Down in the valley, the creek I relied on for my water began to shrink. The wide, slow-moving stream of June became a shallow, hurried trickle in August. By September, it was just a series of disconnected, stagnant pools. The journey for water became longer, harder. I had to walk 3 miles, then 4, to find a pool deep enough to fill my buckets. The valley below was turning from green to a sickly yellow-brown. Dust plumes rose behind every rider, hanging in the still air for hours. One afternoon, Rook began acting strangely. We were in the far northern section of the property, a part one hadn't mapped as thoroughly. It was a chaotic jumble of fractured rock in a wide, shallow basin. He left my side, which was unusual, and began whining, circling a dense, thorny thicket of greasewood bushes that had somehow thrived in a depression. He'd run a few feet away, look back at me, and bark, a sharp, insistent sound. I was hot, tired, and annoyed. "There's nothing there, Rook," I said, my voice raspy from thirst. "Just lizards," but he wouldn't stop. He pawed at the edge of the thicket, whining again. Trusting the dog more than my own judgment, I walked over. The air near the bushes felt different. Not cool, exactly, but heavier, less baked. A strange humidity clung to the spot. Curiosity piqued, I used my hatchet to start clearing the thorny branches. It was slow, painful work. The thorns tore at my shirt and arms. But as I cleared a path to the center, I saw it. The ground wasn't flat. It dipped into a small, almost perfectly circular bowl in the rock, about 10 feet across. And at the very bottom of the bowl, a hairline fracture, dark and damp, snaked across the stone. I knelt, my heart starting to beat a little faster. I pressed my palm against the rock next to the crack. It was cool. Not just shaded, but deep down cold. A cold that seemed to radiate from within the earth. I scrambled back to the shack, my exhaustion forgotten. I grabbed my pickaxe and a shovel. When I returned, I started to work at the fracture. The first few swings of the pickaxe just chipped away small flakes of stone. It was hard, slow going. But then, on the 5th or 6th swing, the head of the axe punched through. It didn't make the solid thud of hitting rock. It made a hollow thwump, followed by a sound that made every hair on my body stand on end. It was the deep, echoing splash of something heavy hitting water. I dropped the pickaxe as if it were hot. I peered into the hole I'd made. At first, all I could see was darkness. But as my eyes adjusted, I saw a glint. A faint shimmer, far below. It was the surface of water. Dark, still, and silent. It wasn't a puddle. It wasn't a cistern. It was a vast, subterranean chamber, and I had just punched a window into its ceiling. I lay on my stomach, the cold air rising from the hole washing over my face, and I started to laugh. It wasn't a sound of humor or joy. It was a raw, incredulous, half-mad sound of discovery. Down below me, hidden under 30 acres of worthless rock, was a secret ocean. I worked for a week in a state of feverish, secret industry. My first priority was widening the hole. I used the pickaxe and a long iron pry bar I'd scavenged to carefully break away the shelf of rock, expanding the opening to about 3 feet wide. Every chip of stone I removed, I carried away and scattered, leaving no evidence of my work. The fear of discovery was a constant, gnawing presence. This was my secret. Mine and Rook's. The sheer scale of it was hard to comprehend. I lowered a rope with a rock tied to the end. It went down 10 feet, then 20, then 50. It was over 100 feet before it finally hit the bottom. This wasn't a well, it was a cathedral of water, a geological miracle sealed away for millennia. I built a simple windlass, a rotating drum made from a sturdy log, with a frame of scavenged timbers. It was crude, but it worked. I braided a long, strong rope and attached my largest bucket. The first time I lowered it down into the darkness and felt it grow heavy, the first time I hauled it up, hand over hand, watching it rise from the blackness, dripping and full, that was a moment of pure, unadulterated triumph. The water was unlike any I had ever tasted. It was ice-cold, even in the midday heat, and had a clean, mineral taste, completely pure. It was the taste of the deep earth. I filled every container I owned. I drank until my stomach ached. I poured it over my head, letting the cold shock wash away the weeks of dust and sweat. Rook drank his fill, his long pink tongue lapping at the precious liquid. While I had found abundance, the valley below was tipping into crisis. The creeks were bone dry now. The Redemption River was a ribbon of cracked mud. The town's wells, dug into the shallow water table of the valley floor, were beginning to fail one by one. The laughter that had defined my inheritance was long gone, replaced by a grim, fearful quiet. You could see the desperation in the way people walked, in the gauntness of their livestock. The grass in the pastures was gone, trampled into a fine, brown powder. The leaves on the cottonwood trees turned yellow and dropped in October, 2 months too early. I sat on my rock, watching the valley die of thirst, and I felt a strange and terrible sense of power. I had what they all needed. The worthless rock, the joke of an inheritance, was now the only source of life for miles in any direction. I guarded my secret jealously, working only at night, camouflaging the opening during the day. The question was no longer how I would survive. The question was what I would do when they finally came. Because I knew, with absolute certainty, that they would come. The first to arrive was Mr. Davies. He didn't ride up with the arrogance he'd shown in the mercantile. He came alone, his horse slow and tired, its head hanging low. He stopped a short distance from my shack and just sat there for a moment, surveying the barren landscape as if seeing it for the first time. I was sitting on my porch, cleaning my skillet, with Rook lying at my feet. The dog didn't get up, but a low, quiet growl rumbled in his chest. I didn't say anything. I just waited. Finally, Davies dismounted and walked toward me, his boots crunching on the gravel. His face was etched with lines of worry I'd never seen before. "Ayas," he said, his voice rough. It was the first time he'd used my name. "I hear you're still managing up here," I nodded slowly, still not speaking. "My wells are dry," he said, the words coming out as if they were being pulled from him. "All 3 of them. Haven't had a drop in a week. My cattle. They're dying." He gestured vaguely back toward his own land, a place that now seemed a world away. I looked past him, at the valley shrouded in a haze of dust. I could almost feel its thirst. "That's a shame," I said, my voice even. He flinched, as if I'd struck him. He licked his chapped lips. "Look, boy. Samuel. I was wrong about this land. It's clear you've made a go of it. I'll buy it from you. Right now. I'll give you $1,000. Cash a year ago, $1,000 would have seemed like all the money in the world. Now, it was an insult. It was the price of his desperation, not the land's worth. "It's not for sale," I said quietly. His face hardened. The old arrogance flickered in his eyes. "Everything's for sale, son." "Name your price." "I just did," I said. "It's not for sale." We stared at each other for a long moment. The silence was thick with the memory of his laughter, of my humiliation. He was a proud man, and I was watching him break. Finally, his shoulders slumped. The fight went out of him. "Please," he whispered, the word seeming to cost him everything. "My family. We have nothing to drink. The cattle can die, but my children." This was the moment. The pivot point on which my entire future would turn. I could have sent him away. I could have savored the victory, watched him ride back down into the dust, a broken man. The part of me that still burned with the shame of that day wanted to. But looking at his cracked face, I didn't see the man who had mocked me. I saw a man terrified for his family. Rook was watching me, his intelligent eyes fixed on my face, as if waiting for my command. Vengeance would have been easy. It would have been satisfying for a moment. But it would have made me just like him. "I won't sell you the land, Mr. Davies," I said, my voice steady. "And I won't give you the water." He looked at the ground, defeated. "But I will sell it to you." He looked up, confused. "What?" "The water," I clarified. "I'll sell you the water. 2 cents a gallon. You bring your own barrels, you do your own hauling." He stared at me, his mind clearly working through the math. It was a fair price. It wasn't charity, but it wasn't extortion. It was a price that respected my labor, my discovery, and my ownership, while still being affordable enough to save his ranch. It was business. 2 cents, he repeated, his voice filled with disbelief and a dawning, grudging respect. "All right, son." "All right." He turned without another word, mounted his horse, and rode away, much faster than he had arrived. The next morning, a procession began. It started with Davies's farmhands, their faces grim, guiding a train of pack mules laden with empty barrels. They didn't speak to me, just filled their containers from the trough I had built, left the coins in a tin box, and departed. The word spread like wildfire through the parched valley. By afternoon, others began to arrive. Small farmers, families from the town, people who had laughed, people who had pitied me, people who had ignored me completely. They came on foot, with buckets. They came with handcarts, with barrels. They formed a quiet, orderly line, their faces a mixture of shame, desperation, and gratitude. I didn't gloat. I didn't remind them of their mockery. I just worked. I manned the windlass, hauling bucket after bucket of cold, clear water from the heart of the earth. Rook sat beside me, a silent, watchful guardian. Ben, the blacksmith, arrived midway through the day. He didn't have any barrels. He just walked up, looked at my crude windlass, looked at the long line of people, and then looked at me. "Looks like you learned how to read the bones," he said with a rare, small smile. He took off his leather apron. "You'll wear your arms out like that. Let's build this proper for the rest of the day, and into the next." He and I worked. Using timbers I paid for with the first day's earnings, we built a better, more efficient geared winch system. We built a proper loading platform and a series of troughs. We turned my lucky discovery into an operation. The townspeople watched us work, their silence a testament to the complete reversal of my fortune. I was no longer the boy with the worthless rocks. I was the man with the water. And in a time of drought, that made me the most powerful man in the valley. The drought held on for 2 more months, a long, dry season of dust and desperation. During that time, my well became the beating heart of Redemption Valley. The daily procession of barrels and buckets became a fixture of life. The clank of my winch and the splash of water into containers was the new sound of the valley, replacing the whisper of wind through dry grass. The money accumulated, but the transformation was about more than wealth. It was about the slow, painful erosion of old prejudices. The people who had once laughed at me now depended on me for their very lives. They never apologized, not in words. But they apologized in other ways. In the averted eyes that held a new respect. In the way a woman left a freshly baked loaf of bread on the collection box. In the way a father, after filling his family's canteens, turned and gave me a stiff, formal nod of thanks. One day, a man from the state capital arrived. He was a geologist, a man of science with charts and strange instruments. He'd heard rumors of a boy who'd found an inexhaustible well on a granite shelf. He spent 2 days on my land, taking measurements, testing the water, and studying my hand-drawn maps. On the final day, he sat with me and Ben by the wellhead. "Young man," he said, his voice filled with academic awe, "do you have any idea what you've found?" I shook my head. "This isn't just a well," he explained, pointing to his charts. "It's an artesian spring, fed by a massive, ancient aquifer trapped in a syncline of impermeable rock. The water is thousands of years old. It's a geological anomaly. The pressure from the surrounding mountains forces it up. You didn't just dig a well, you uncorked a bottle that's been sealed since the Ice Age." He called it the Aes Aquifer. He said it was one of the most significant groundwater discoveries in the territory. My 30 acres of worthless rock, he told me, sat atop a reservoir that could sustain the entire region for 100 years, drought or no drought. When the rains finally came, they came with a gentle persistence, soaking into the thirsty ground for a week straight. The river began to flow again. The valley floor slowly, miraculously, began to show a faint blush of green. The lines at my well dwindled and then stopped. But the valley was forever changed. I was no longer the town outcast. I was its anchor. Using the money I had earned, I didn't leave. I invested. I paid to have a proper stone well house built over the spring, with a powerful pump and a pipeline that ran all the way to a new cistern in the center of town, ensuring Redemption Valley would never go thirsty again. I bought the failing mercantile and restocked its shelves. I funded the construction of a small schoolhouse, hiring a teacher from back east. Her name was Anna, and she had eyes that saw not the boy who was laughed at, but the man who had turned rock into water. Years passed. The scars of the great drought faded from the land, but not from the memory of the people. The Aes Aquifer, as the maps now called it, became the foundation of a new prosperity. The town of Redemption grew, no longer dependent on the whims of a single river. New families arrived, drawn by the promise of reliable water. Mr. Davies's ranch recovered, and while we were never friends, a quiet, respectful distance formed between us. He paid for his water like everyone else, and in doing so, we both found a measure of peace. I married Anna. We built a proper house, not far from the original shack, which I kept as a reminder. We raised 2 children on that land, a son and a daughter, who grew up knowing the true story of the rock that had saved a valley. Ben became like a grandfather to them, a fixture in our lives until the day he passed, his hammer finally falling silent. He left me his anvil, his most prized possession, a block of solid iron that had shaped the lives of everyone in the valley in one way or another. I never forgot the feeling of that first day, the heat of shame, the sting of laughter. But it no longer had power over me. It was just the beginning of the story, the first chapter in a book I was still writing. The humiliation had been a fire, yes, but it had not consumed me. It had forged me. It had given me a resilience that soft ground and easy living never could have. Tonight, I sit on my porch. I am no longer a young man. My hands are gnarled, my hair is grey, but my eyes can still see the beauty in the hard, clean lines of the rock. A new dog, a descendant of Rook, lies at my feet, his breathing a slow, steady rhythm in the quiet evening air. The lights of the town I helped rebuild twinkle in the valley below, a constellation of lives made possible by a secret hidden in the earth. The well house stands as a silent monument, not to me, but to a simple, profound truth, that the greatest value is often hidden beneath a surface of worthlessness. It's a lesson the earth taught me, and one I've tried to live by. And it makes me wonder, as I look out at the world, what are you standing on right now? What is the worthless rock in your own life, the burden, the joke, the struggle that everyone else tells you to abandon? What secret ocean of strength, what hidden reservoir of purpose, is waiting just beneath the surface, waiting for you to have the stubborn courage to start digging?